Nevada Territory, 1886. The wind did not howl through the valley so much as it scraped against the landscape, a raw and relentless friction that stripped the sagebrush bare and polished the exposed rock until it shone like old bone. Gideon watched the gray horizon from the single, uncracked pane of his front window, his breath clouding the glass in rhythmic, ghostly puffs. It was the kind of cold that settled into the timber of the house, making the floorboards groan under the weight of the silence. He had lived alone in this cabin for 3 years, ever since the fever had swept through the settlement and taken the noise, the warmth, and the reason for keeping a fire stoked past midnight. Now he kept the stove fed only out of a grim habit of survival, a mechanical refusal to let the frost claim the interior as it had the fields outside. The calendar nailed to the wall near the pantry remained the only thing in the house that changed, though only because Gideon marked an X through each day with a piece of charcoal. It was December 20th. The date loomed like a storm front, heavy and unavoidable. He had not intended to invite anyone into this space. The isolation was a carefully constructed fortification, a way to ensure that he never had to speak words that felt too large for his mouth, or see pity in the eyes of the townspeople when he went in for supplies. But the approaching holiday had gnawed at him, a dull ache in the center of his chest that refused to subside. It was not the day itself that frightened him, but the silence that would accompany it. The thought of sitting at the rough-hewn table, staring at a plate of cold beans and biscuit while the wind battered the walls, was suddenly unbearable. It was a weakness, he told himself, a momentary crack in his resolve. 2 days ago, in a moment of impulsive desperation, he had pinned a scrawled note to the board at the mercantile in town. Wanted. Cook for Christmas meal. 1 day work. Fair pay. He had expected no one. The town was miles away, the road treacherous with ice, and his reputation as a recluse was well established. Yet he found himself checking the road, a nervous energy thrumming beneath his skin. He told himself he wanted a meal, a proper roast like Sarah used to make, but deep down he knew he was purchasing a distraction. He was buying a few hours where the house would sound like something other than a tomb. The snow began to fall in the early afternoon, not in soft flakes, but in hard, driving pellets that hissed against the log walls. Gideon turned from the window and walked to the hearth, kneeling to shove another log into the fire. The room was sparse, stripped of the decorative touches that had once softened its edges. The braided rugs were rolled up in the corner. The curtains were plain muslin, yellowed with age. He had removed the photographs from the mantel 2 winters ago, placing them face down in a drawer because he could no longer bear the way the eyes seemed to follow him. He was a man who had pared his life down to the essentials of work and sleep, terrified that anything more would cause the fragile equilibrium to collapse. When the sound came, it was so faint he almost mistook it for a branch striking the siding. It was a rhythmic, deliberate thudding, a knock. Gideon froze, the firewood heavy in his hand. He stood slowly, dusting the bark from his palms, and looked toward the heavy oak door. It seemed impossible that anyone had made the climb up the ridge in this weather. He waited, half hoping the wind had played a trick on him, but the knock came again, firmer this time. He crossed the room, his boots heavy on the plank floor, and lifted the iron latch. The wind seized the door immediately, trying to rip it from his grip, and a flurry of snow swept into the room, instantly melting on the warm floorboards. Standing on the threshold, framed against the swirling white void of the storm, was a figure he had not expected. She was small, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl that was dusted with white, her face almost entirely hidden by the hood. She wore a prairie dress of dark blue calico, the hem wet and heavy with snow, and sturdy boots that looked too large for her feet. She did not see shivering, though the cold must have been biting through her layers. Gideon stared, blocking the entrance with his broad frame. He had expected, perhaps, the widow Miller from town, or maybe an older matron looking for extra coin. He had not expected a stranger. He had certainly not expected a Chinese woman, standing alone on his porch in the middle of a Nevada blizzard. She looked up, pushing the hood back slightly to reveal a face that was young, but etched with a weary solemnity. Her eyes were dark and steady, refusing to look away from his stern gaze. "Mr. Vance?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear against the wind. "I saw the notice." Gideon did not move immediately. The prejudices of the territory were strong, and while he considered himself a fair man, the sight of her disarmed him. "The road is closed," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "How did you get here?" She gestured vaguely behind her, toward the vague outline of the trail. "The supply wagon. The driver let me off at the turn. I walked the rest." Gideon looked past her. The turn was 2 miles down. 2 miles in this wind. He looked back at her face, seeing the red flush of windburn on her cheeks and the tight set of her jaw. She was not asking for charity. She was standing tall, clutching a carpet bag with both hands. "I am Lynn," she said. "I can cook. The notice said fair pay." She did not plead. There was a dignity in her posture that cut through his hesitation. He realized then that he could not leave a dog out in this weather, let alone a woman who had walked 2 miles in the snow to answer his request. He stepped back, pulling the door wider. "Come in," he said gruffly, "before the heat goes." Lynn stepped over the threshold, bringing the scent of ozone and sage into the stale air of the cabin. Gideon pushed the door shut against the wind and latched it, the finality of the sound echoing in the sudden quiet. She did not wait for him to take her coat. She unwrapped the shawl with efficient, practiced movements, shaking the snow onto the mat before folding the garment neatly over her arm. Under the heavy wool, her prairie dress was neat, the high collar buttoned strictly to her throat. She looked around the room, her gaze taking in the bare walls, the dust on the sideboard, the cold sterility of the space. She did not judge, but she observed. Gideon felt a sudden, sharp spike of defensiveness. "It's not much," he said, moving toward the kitchen area. "I wasn't expecting company, just help." Lynn placed her bag on the floor near the door. "I am not company," she said softly. "I am the help." She walked toward the stove, extending her hands toward the radiant heat. Her fingers were red and stiff, and for a moment Gideon saw a tremor in them before she clasped them together, hiding the weakness. "You have a kitchen?" she asked, turning to him. Gideon pointed to the alcove at the back of the cabin. "Stove's there. Pantry is behind it. I have venison in the cold box outside and potatoes in the cellar." Lynn nodded and moved past him into the kitchen. Her presence in the space was jarring. For years this room had contained only his lumbering stride and the heavy silence of his grief. Now the soft swish of her skirts and the click of her boot heels on the wood created a new rhythm. She did not ask for permission to explore the kitchen. She simply began. She opened the firebox of the cook stove, checking the coals, then lifted the lids of the pots sitting on the side. She opened the pantry door and peered into the darkness. Gideon stood by the hearth, feeling like an intruder in his own home. He watched her pull a cast-iron skillet from the hook, examining the seasoning on the bottom. She ran a finger along the rim, checking for rust. "This needs oil," she said, more to herself than to him. She turned to look at him. "The notice said Christmas dinner. That is tomorrow night." Gideon nodded. "Yes, tomorrow." She looked at the meager supplies he had pointed out. "Venison and potatoes," she repeated. Her tone was neutral, but he felt the weight of the unspoken critique. "I have flour," he added quickly, "and dried apples." "I brought things," Lynn said, gesturing to her carpet bag. "The wagon, the driver said you live alone. Men who live alone eat to survive, not to remember." The words struck him with the precision of a blade. Not to remember. That was exactly it. He ate to silence the hunger, nothing more. Lynn walked back to her bag and carried it to the kitchen table. She unbuckled the straps and opened it. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and cloth, were bundles of varying shapes. She lifted them out with a reverence he reserved for his tools. There were jars of dark liquid, dried bundles of herbs he didn't recognize, and a small sack of rice. "I will cook," she said, looking up at him, "but I will cook my way. The venison is good, but the flavor must be right." Gideon frowned. "I wanted a roast, traditional." Lynn paused, her hand resting on a jar of star anise. "Tradition is what we carry with us," she said. "You have your ghosts, Mr. Vance. I have mine. We will feed them both." The cryptic statement hung in the air. Gideon wanted to argue, to demand the plain, salted meat he understood, but he looked at her eyes again. They were old eyes, eyes that had seen loss just as deep as his. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. "As long as it's hot," he said, "and as long as the house smells like something other than dust." The morning of the 24th broke with a sky the color of bruised iron. The snow had stopped, but the wind remained, whistling through the chinking of the logs. Gideon woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years, the rhythmic chopping of a knife against a wooden board. He lay in his bed for a moment, disoriented, the heavy quilt pulled up to his chin. Usually the morning was a battle of will, a forced march into the cold air. Today the air in the loft carried a faint, warm humidity. He dressed quickly, pulling on his flannel shirt and heavy trousers, and climbed down the ladder. The main room was transformed. The fire in the hearth was roaring, casting a flickering orange light across the floor. But it was the kitchen that held his attention. Lynn was already working, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The kitchen table, usually a catch-all for his tools and unread newspapers, was scrubbed clean. On it lay the venison, but it was no longer a single, imposing slab. She had broken it down, slicing the meat into thin, precise strips that lay fanned out on a platter. Gideon walked into the kitchen, the floorboards creaking. "You didn't roast it," he said, staring at the meat. It wasn't an accusation, but it was close. He had spent the night dreaming of the thick, heavy roasts Sarah used to make, the kind that sat in the stomach like a stone and made you sleep for hours. This looked delicate. Lynn did not stop chopping. She was mincing something green and pungent, scallions, he realized, smelling the sharp, oniony bite in the air. Next to the scallions was a pile of minced ginger, its spicy warmth cutting through the stale smell of the cabin. "Roasting dries the spirit," Lynn said without looking up. "The meat becomes hard. Today we stir the life back into it." She swept the scallions into a small bowl and reached for the jar of dark liquid, soy sauce, though Gideon only knew it as a curiosity he'd seen in the mining camps. She poured it over the venison, mixing it with her bare hands, massaging the dark, salty liquid into the red meat. "You hired me for Christmas," she said. "Christmas is about birth, about new things. Why eat the old way?" She moved to the stove where a large, deep pan he didn't recognize sat over the hottest part of the fire. It was round-bottomed and black as midnight. "Where did you get that?" Gideon asked. "It was in my bag," she said. "It is a wok. It knows fire better than your flat skillets." She added a dollop of lard to the wok, and it hissed violently, melting instantly into a clear pool. The sound was aggressive, energetic. Gideon took a step back, leaning against the doorframe. He watched as she threw the ginger and some dried red peppers into the oil. The reaction was immediate. A plume of aromatic steam rose up, filling the kitchen with a scent that was spicy, choking, and incredibly alive. Gideon coughed, waving his hand in front of his face, but he didn't leave. The smell was foreign, yes, but it woke up senses he had allowed to go dormant. It smelled of heat and energy. It didn't smell like the gray, lonely winter outside. Lynn worked with a focus that was mesmerizing. She tossed the marinated venison into the smoking wok. The sound was a roar, a continuous crackle of moisture meeting extreme heat. She didn't let the meat sit. She kept it moving, using a long metal spatula to flip and toss the strips so they danced in the oil. The dark soy sauce caramelized on the meat, creating a rich, savory glaze that coated the air in the room. Gideon found his mouth watering, a primal reaction he hadn't expected. He had thought he wanted the comfort of the known, the safety of a bland potato and a salted roast. But watching this woman command the fire, seeing the flash of the steel and the dark gloss of the meat, he felt a stirring of something else. It was curiosity. It was a break in the monotony. For the first time in 3 years, the house felt like it contained something unpredictable. "It smells strong," Gideon said, his voice struggling to find the right word. Lynn stopped tossing the meat for a second, allowing it to sear. She looked at him through the haze of steam, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Strong is good," she said. "Grief is quiet. Life is loud. The food should be loud." She added the chopped scallions and a handful of the dried mushrooms she had soaked in water earlier. The earthy, damp scent of the mushrooms mingled with the sharp ginger and the savory meat. It was a complex symphony of smells that made the simple cabin feel larger, as if the walls had expanded to accommodate a world beyond the Nevada snow. Gideon watched her hands, rough, capable, scarred from work. They were hands that knew how to survive, just as his did. But she was using her survival to create something, while he had been using his to merely endure. She reached for a small bag of sugar and sprinkled a pinch over the dish, the crystals melting instantly into the sauce. "Balance," she murmured. "Bitter and sweet, hot and cold. You cannot have one without the other." Gideon watched the steam swirl around her, the prairie dress looking out of place against the exotic energy of the cooking. Yet somehow she was the most grounded thing in the room. He realized he was standing up straighter. The heaviness in his chest, the one that usually crushed him by midday, felt lighter, displaced by the sheer sensory volume of what was happening in his kitchen. He wasn't sure if he would like the taste, but he knew, with a sudden, startling clarity, that he was hungry, truly hungry. The table sat in the center of the room like a neglected altar, its surface scarred by years of careless use and the dry, biting air of the high desert. Lynn stood before it, her hands resting on her hips, her critical gaze sweeping over the rough planks. She had turned the cooking into a symphony of sound and smell, but now she required a stage for the final movement. Gideon watched her from the safety of the kitchen doorway, the scent of ginger and seared meat clinging to his flannel shirt. He felt unmoored, drifting in his own home. The cabin, usually a fortress of brown and gray, was now alive with a sensory aggression he hadn't prepared for. "We need a cloth," Lynn said, turning to him. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the same calm authority she had used to command the fire. "Food this alive cannot sit on dead wood. It needs respect." Gideon stiffened. He knew where the tablecloths were. They were buried at the bottom of the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, beneath the heavy wool blankets he never used and the dresses he couldn't bear to give away. To open that chest was to exhale the breath he had been holding for 3 years. "It's fine as it is," he muttered, his eyes darting to the window where the snow had begun to pile against the glass. "It's just a meal. We don't need the finery." Lynn did not move. She waited, her silence acting as a lever prying at his resistance. She understood, perhaps better than he did, that the refusal wasn't about the laundry. "If it is just a meal," she said softly, "then I should have made the beans. But we agreed to feed the ghosts, Mr. Vance. Do your ghosts deserve bare wood?" Her words were precise, cutting through his defenses with surgical accuracy. Gideon clenched his jaw, the muscles working beneath his beard. He looked at the table, then at her steady, dark eyes. She wasn't mocking him. She was challenging him to step back into the world of the living, where things were done with care rather than necessity. With a heavy sigh that rattled in his chest, Gideon turned and walked to the sleeping alcove. The hinges of the cedar chest shrieked in protest, a sound that seemed to echo the tightness in his throat. He dug past the rough wool, his fingers brushing against soft cotton and lace, textures that felt alien to his calloused hands. He found it, a white linen cloth, embroidered with small blue flowers along the hem. Sarah had stitched them during the long winter of '82. He pulled it out, the fabric cool and smelling of dried lavender and trapped thyme. He carried it back to the main room like a flag of surrender. Lynn took it from him without a word, her hands smoothing the wrinkles with a gentle, rhythmic motion, transforming the rough table into a landscape of sudden, shocking brightness. The transformation of the table shifted the gravity of the room. What had been a bachelor's dark burrow now held a square of civilized light. Lynn set the table, not with the tin plates Gideon used, but with 2 porcelain bowls she had pulled from her carpet bag. They were mismatched, one with a crack running down the side like a vein of gold, the other painted with fading blue fish. She placed the chopsticks beside them, and then, seeing Gideon's hesitation, she retrieved 2 forks from his drawer and placed them alongside. The compromise was silent and gracious. She brought the wok to the table, setting it on a trivet of woven straw. The heat radiating from the black metal was intense, carrying the complex aroma of the stir-fry, the iron tang of the meat, the sweetness of the caramelized onions, and that sharp, mysterious undercurrent of star anise. Gideon sat down slowly, the chair creaking under his weight. He felt oversized and clumsy against the delicate setup, a bear invited to a tea party. Lynn sat opposite him, her posture upright, her hands folded in her lap for a brief moment of stillness. The storm outside battered the walls, a chaotic fury that made the circle of lamplight feel fragile and precious. "Eat," she said, nodding toward the steaming vessel, "while the spirit is still in the steam." Gideon reached for the serving spoon, his hands shaking slightly. He scooped a portion of the dark, glistening meat and vegetables into his bowl. The steam hit his face, damp and savory. He picked up the fork, feeling the weight of the silver, and took a bite. The flavor was a shock to his system. He was used to the dull, salty monotony of cured meats and root vegetables boiled into submission. This was an explosion. The venison was tender, yielding instantly to the tooth, but it was the sauce that stunned him. It was salty, sweet, and carried a heat that bloomed at the back of his throat. Not painful, but warming, spreading down into his chest like a shot of good whiskey. The ginger cut through the heaviness of the game, making the dish taste bright and urgent. He chewed slowly, his eyes widening. He looked at Lynn. She was eating with her chopsticks, her movements fluid and practiced, lifting small morsels of meat and mushroom with a grace that made his fork seem barbaric. Gideon started, then stopped, his voice failing him. He swallowed, feeling the warmth settle in his stomach. "It's not like anything I've ever had. It wakes you up." Lynn nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Winter makes the blood slow," she said. "The food must be the fire. If you eat cold things, you become the snow. If you eat fire, you survive." They ate in a silence that was different from the one Gideon lived with. His usual silence was a void, a lack of presence. This silence was companionable, filled with the small domestic sounds of dining, the click of chopsticks against porcelain, the scrape of a fork, the soft exhale of satisfaction. For the first time in years, Gideon was not thinking about the empty chair at the end of the table or the cold side of the bed. He was entirely focused on the sensation of the meal, the interplay of textures, the crunch of the scallions, the chew of the mushrooms. He found himself reaching for seconds, then thirds. The knot of anxiety that had lived in his solar plexus for days began to unravel, loosened by the heat and the sheer pleasure of nourishment. As the level of food in the wok lowered, the tension in the room dissipated. Gideon wiped his mouth with the napkin, feeling a strange, heavy contentment. He looked at Lynn, really looked at her, past the utility of her presence. He saw the fatigue around her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped slightly now that the work was done. "You came a long way for a day's wage," he said, his voice low. "The mines are closer. The town has work." It was an invitation to speak, the first he had offered. Lynn lowered her chopsticks, resting them on the rim of her bowl. She looked at the center of the table, at the empty space where the steam had been. "The town has eyes," she said quietly. "In the town, I am the Chinese woman. I am the curiosity, or I am the target." She looked up at him, her gaze direct and unblinking. "My husband worked the rails near Truckee. The rock took him 3 years ago, a blast that came too soon." Gideon felt a jolt of recognition. 3 years, the same timeline, the same span of gray days. "Since then," she continued, "I move, I cook, I wash, but I do not stay. To stay is to let the memories catch you." She paused, her fingers tracing the painted fish on her bowl. "When I saw your paper, wanted cook for Christmas, it did not ask for a wife. It did not ask for a laundry woman. It asked for a cook. And it was far away. I thought, here is a man who is also running from the noise." Gideon looked down at his hands, resting on the white linen. The blue flowers seemed to vibrate in the lamplight. "I wasn't running," he said, his voice raspy. "I was hiding. There's a difference." "Is there?" Lynn asked. The question hung in the air, gentle but demanding. Gideon looked at the fire crackling in the hearth. "The fever took Sarah," he said. The name tasted strange in his mouth, like a word from a foreign language he used to speak fluently. "And the baby. Within a week of each other." It was quiet after that. The quiet was the only thing I could manage. If I let the noise in, if I let people in. He trailed off, unable to articulate the terror of happiness, the fear that feeling anything good was a betrayal of the dead. Lynn watched him, her expression softening into a profound empathy. She reached out, not to touch him, but to push the wok slightly toward the center of the table, a grounding gesture. "The wok," she said, pointing to the black iron. "It is beaten into shape by hammers, thousands of hits. It is burned in fire every time it is used. But because of the hammering and because of the fire, it does not break. It feeds." She leaned forward slightly. "You cannot hide from the winter, Mr. Vance. You are part of the season. But you can build a fire that is hotter than the snow. That is what we did tonight." Gideon looked at the wok, at the black patina that shone with the memory of the oil. He thought of the violence of the cooking, the hissing, the searing, the tossing. It was a violent act of creation. He had been treating his grief like a fragile glass ornament, something to be protected in a dark room. But Lynn carried her grief like a tool, something tempered and useful. She had used her loss to fuel her independence, her skill. She hadn't forgotten her husband. She was surviving because of what she had learned with him. The realization settled over him, heavier and more substantial than the meal. He pushed his chair back, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "I have apple pie," he said, abruptly standing up. It's dried apples, not fresh, but it's sweet." It was a clumsy offering, a desperate attempt to prolong the evening, to keep this new energy from slipping out the door with the morning wind. Lynn smiled, a genuine transformation of her face that made her look younger, less burdened. "Dried apples are good," she said. "They have patience. I will make tea." They moved into the rhythm of the evening with an ease that surprised them both. The plates were cleared, the water was boiled, the storm outside began to break, the howling wind dropping to a low, mournful moan that seemed distant, no longer scratching at the door. They sat by the fire this time, the table abandoned for the intimacy of the hearth. Gideon ate the pie, which Lynn had dusted with a pinch of her 5-spice powder, giving the familiar American dessert a warmth and complexity that confused and delighted him. They spoke of small things, the depth of the snow, the price of flour, the way the light hit the canyon walls in August. But beneath the trivialities, a current of understanding flowed. When the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, signaling the arrival of Christmas, the silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was peaceful. Lynn stood up, smoothing her dress. "It is late," she said. "The wagon will not come until the road is cleared. That may be noon." Gideon stood as well. The thought of her leaving, of the house returning to its static state, sent a spike of panic through him, but he pushed it down. He would not trap her. "You can take the bedroom," he said. "I'll take the loft. It's warm up there." Lynn hesitated, looking at the door to the bedroom, the room he hadn't slept in since Sarah died. "Are you sure?" she asked. "That is a private room." Gideon nodded, feeling the magnitude of the offer. "It's just a room," he said, lying only slightly. "It needs to be used. The ghosts don't sleep there anymore." The morning sun on Christmas Day was blinding, reflecting off the pristine white blanket that covered the valley. Gideon woke to the smell of coffee and something else, something savory and comforting. He climbed down the ladder, his joints stiff but his spirit strangely light. Lynn was at the stove, stirring the leftovers of the rice and venison into a porridge, a congee that bubbled thickly. She looked back at him as he entered. "Happy Christmas," she said. The greeting was simple, stripped of the forced cheerfulness of the town. "Happy Christmas," Gideon replied. He walked to the window. The sky was a piercing blue. The road would be passable by midday. The countdown he had dreaded was over. The holiday was here, and he had survived it. More than survived it, he had felt it. He turned back to the room. The white tablecloth was still on the table, a flag of victory. The house felt lived in. It felt like a home, not a museum of sorrow. They ate breakfast on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the steam from their bowls rise into the crisp air. The silence of the winter morning was vast, but it no longer felt lonely. It felt expectant. When the sound of the wagon wheels finally crunched on the icy road below, the reality of the departure set in. Lynn stood up, gathering her bowls. "I will pack," she said. Gideon watched her go inside. He stayed on the porch, looking at the horizon. He could let her go. He could pay her the fair wage, add a generous tip, and watch the wagon disappear. He would have the leftovers. He would have the memory. But as he looked at the smoke rising from his own chimney, he realized that the fire needed tending. It wasn't a one-time act. It was a daily labor. He walked inside as she was buckling her carpet bag. The kitchen was spotless, the wok cleaned and oiled, hanging on the wall as if it belonged there. "Lynn," he said. She stopped, her hand on the strap. She turned to face him. "The winter is long here," Gideon said, his voice steady. "And the spring is hard work. The garden, the repairs." He took a breath, searching for the words that would bridge the gap between need and care. "I can't offer you a past. We both have those. But I can offer a wage, a fair one, and a room that isn't a ghost trap." He gestured to the kitchen. "And a kitchen that needs loud food." Lynn looked at him, her expression unreadable for a long moment. She looked at the wok, then at the white tablecloth, and finally at the man who was standing in the center of his own life for the first time in years. She didn't drop the bag, but she didn't pick it up either. "The garden?" she asked. "What do you grow?" "Potatoes," Gideon said. "Mostly potatoes." Lynn made a small sound, almost a laugh. "Potatoes are boring," she said. "We can grow bok choy. It likes the cold." "Bok choy," Gideon repeated, the word feeling strange and promising on his tongue. "I can plow a new row." "Good," Lynn said. She tightened the strap on her bag, but then she set it down on the bench, not on the floor near the door. "Then I will wait for the next wagon to take my earnings to the bank. But I will stay for the dinner. You cannot eat alone on Christmas night either." Gideon felt a knot loosen in his chest, a physical sensation of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He nodded, a slow, deep affirmation. "No," he said, "I can't." He moved to the stove and picked up the kettle. "More tea?" he asked. "Yes," Lynn said, walking back to the kitchen, her boots clicking on the floor with the rhythm of a heart that had decided, against all odds, to keep beating. "More tea."